Hello, my friends, and welcome to another PhilosIffy, where I talk about the various philosophic merit that I found in a game that I recently played in a super non-formal way. The most recent thing that really stood out to me was that I went and played a game called Alice Madness Returns. And having just finished playing it, I thought I would talk a little bit about how the game engaged certain philosophic concepts. The concept of questioning. But first, I just want to talk about the game a little bit. For me, it was really interesting how the game was very true to the original novel, Alice in Wonderland, that it was based off of is in its aesthetic and in its themes, mostly because sort of the original Alice in Wonderland used a sort of decorum, a properness about its language in order to hide some very visceral and dark undertones that really made the book what it was. Whereas in this video game, Alice Madness Returns, those visceral, dark undertones became the overtones to a very significant degree, whereas the language, the decorum, the properness of British society was lessened to be the undertone. It was sort of because of that switching that it gained the merit that I saw in it. Alice Madness Returns doesn't really make any conclusions. It doesn't make any statements about any of its horrible subject matter, everything from murder to abuse, prostitution, and drug use to just in general, corruptness in society, in medical practices like psychology, or in social practices like orphanages. All of that was in there. But the main character, Alice, never really protested against any of the horrible things that were going on. They were common. They were just part of what society was, and in proper decorum, in polite society, that the language that the character used gave a tacit acceptance of everything, despite obviously being against it, would never speak out against it. However, something that's cool about that is that it left everything open to being questioned, in not just the one way, questioning, hey, I think that's wrong, so I'm going to question you, but more of asking generally questions about it as what it could be, what it means, is it right or wrong, things like that. So the script of Alice Madness Returns focused almost exclusively on asking questions of the world, of its people, or kind of nothing, just to add weirdness to the dialogue. The questions tended to really quickly cycle through Aristotle's taxonomy on determining a thing's nature. Now, a taxonomy is any system of categorization, and Aristotle came up with so many that he became sort of famous for it, being called things like the father of science, or more specifically, the father of taxonomies. And of course, philosophy is all about, knowing the why, trying to figure out the why of something. But Aristotle, realizing that he didn't really know what about anything, and that the what, figuring out what anything was extremely necessary for figuring out why later, sort of made that his main focus. He was pretty much obsessed with knowing the what. So his taxonomy for figuring out something's nature essentially had four parts: the substance, the form, the purpose, and the final end, or teleological purpose. To give an example of what doing that process would be like, finding out something's substance, we'll take a sword for example. So the substance of a sword is literally going to be its physical makeup, its atomic structure. It's made of metal, maybe it's made of some wood, some cloth, things like that. A little bit of carbon, a little bit of iron stuff. and that will be the substance of a sword. The form is where description gets a little bit hard, especially when you get more specific, because a sword is, well, sword shaped. It's not a circle, it's not a triangle or a square or anything like that. It's sword shaped. It has the blade part, it has the holding part, maybe it has a grip part, and it's sort of generally accepted to be longer than a knife, but not as long as just giant sheets of sharpened metal. The purpose is to cut things, but namely to be used as a weapon for cutting, which would distinguish it from like a kitchen knife or something like that. And the final end, or teleological purpose, would be when a sword reaches its perfect form. It is the utmost sword a sword could possibly be, and that would make it the best sword, the final reckoning of what a sword could be. So that final part, that final step of the taxonomy, is the part which really gets confusing when you're dealing with more complicated subject matter, especially when you're dealing with something as complex as, say, a human. Even the second categorization of form, before you even get to purpose or final end, becomes extremely difficult to talk about. The Mad Hatter character in Alice Madness Returns, as he should be, ran through asking about each of these categories of Aristotle's taxonomy so quickly that we players could easily miss whether he was asking questions at all, just because it sounded like the ramblings of a mad person. And of course, much of the game sounds like the ramblings of mad people because they did that on purpose. But in specifically making conversations be based on asking questions rather than actually having any sort of dialogue, it sort of made this examination the forefront of everything that was going on, even though the actual gameplay or the character, or we as players engaging with it, really didn't have much to do in terms of engaging the philosophical dialogue, because there wasn't a dialogue. They were just asking the questions of the categories over and over, in different ways and in weird ways, to make it seem like they weren't asking about anything. And of course they threw in quite a few useless random questions just to have weirdness. Now, the gameplay for Alice Madness Returns is not the best. Some of the core mechanics really don't mesh. For example, all the combat takes place on the ground, but Alice jumps and has to land. It's a platformer, but you can't do anything to protect yourself or fight anything in the air. And so what ends up happening is that enemies who have automatic detection of you will see you, and then you'll try to attack, and you can't even land on the next area before kind of getting messed up. The aesthetics were very unique and varied, and all in all the game was very entertaining. But really what stood out for me was less the gameplay and more of its dialogue, more of its use of questions. Nowadays in philosophy, it's mostly about the business of collecting data and trying to find answers that work with that data. Fewer people in philosophy put their focus on making new ways or thinking of new ways to ask questions, or the very means of questioning that we employ, and the best practices for inquiry. So I spent a few hours with Alice Madness Returns. At times it seemed dragging. The gameplay did get a bit repetitive. The boss fights weren't epic, they were just larger puzzles. But the game serves as a good reminder for the distance that can be taken when all you have is questioning things rather than really finding too many answers, and how much information, how much knowledge you can get just from trying to ask rather than trying to answer something right away. Questioning what's around us, and yes, more importantly, questioning ourselves and our own perspective of those things. So go and check out Madness Returns. It may be a bit of a slog, but pay attention to the dialogue. Paying attention to the whole questioning aspect of it really gave it a new dimension that you don't see with most games that you come around nowadays. And I will see you guys in my next video of PhilosIffy. Sefilo.